Welcome to the Unconventional Dyad podcast, where you'll find broad topics, an unconventional dyad, and one shared goal, educating ourselves through challenging and engaging conversations. Your hosts are Carli and Laura, two graduate students and friends committed to having discussions that are real, raw, and unpolished. Thank you for joining us. Hello, everyone. Welcome to episode 6 of the Unconventional Dyad podcast, where we talk to Dr. Claudia Luiz. Dr. Luiz is the author of a new introductory textbook in psychoanalysis, written as a set of stories about treatment. The book is called The Making of a Psychoanalyst, Studies in Emotional Education, and it was published in 2018. Dr. Luiz is a prolific writer, receiving awards such as the Phyllis W. Meadow Award for Excellence in Psychoanalytic Writing, and she was also a first-place winner of the 2008 Reader's Digest Best Writers Website Award. Dr. Luiz is on the faculty of the Academy for Clinical and Applied Psychoanalysis in Livingston, New Jersey, and she has offices in New York City and Tarrytown, New York. She lives with her husband, John Luiz, a writer with whom she shares 2 college-age daughters. And we are so excited to have her on the podcast today. And we thank you, our listeners, for joining us in this conversation.
Well, my name is Claudia Luiz, and I became a psychoanalyst when I was 16 because I was in trouble. And I got into therapy, fortunately, with a very wonderful elderly gentleman with a huge paunch and a twinkle in his eye. And he invited me to become an analyst. He really saw something in me. And from that moment forward, I decided to do that. When I was studying psychoanalysis, it was not accredited. It's very interesting if you look at the history of what's called lay analysis. Because I am a lay analyst, meaning I do not have a medical degree. This was a big question around Freud's time, and pretty much psychoanalysis became a subspecialty of medicine. Then it became a subspecialty of psychology, and then it became a subspecialty of social work. And only in the past decade has psychoanalysis become an accredited discipline, meaning you can get a degree and you can get a license without being an MD or a psychologist or social work. So this is a huge triumph for lay analysts. And who were lay analysts? Who were people who weren't going to medical school? They were people who didn't have the money or didn't have the wherewithal, who were patients, sometimes schizophrenics, borderline, sometimes depressives, who had had a fantastic experience in their own analysis and decided to give back and become less like me. And the fact that we've only recently been recognized and that such a change really speaks well for the world. It's like seeing just how the world is changing as far as rights all around and what's happening with patriarchy. That's the inside story on psychoanalysis. So that's who I am. Believe it or not, there is still such a system in place for accreditation, and this is all across the board. It's in philosophy departments. There's an accrediting. My daughter's studying philosophy in college, and she's studying Caribbean philosophy, and it's not in the philosophy department. It's in the Afro-American department. Explain that to me, because that branch of philosophy has not been accredited by the philosophy accrediting body, who says you should be reading Plato and Socrates. Guess what? That is the white patriarchy legacy. So even everywhere you turn, you see accrediting bodies that are dominated by patriarchal systems of thought that see themselves as intrinsically superior and then cast down their vote and decide who's going to be in power. So I bring that to you as to who I am, me and my daughter.
I would love to explore that further with you. Before we get there, I'm curious about how your past experiences, your journey into psychoanalysis has really shaped who you are as a therapist, how you approach therapy. I'm really curious about how your history has influenced who you are as a psychoanalyst.
Well, coming into psychoanalysis as a patient and into a discipline that is not accredited, meaning you can't get a PhD from it, shaped me unbelievably, because it meant that everything that I was doing was not for a career goal. And many, many people told me that I was really dumb to sink my money and my time into psychoanalysis unless I was an MD or a psychologist. But because I'd had this incredible experience, I was a hardcore lay analyst. So I was in school forever. And finally, I got my certificate, which was pretty useless. But to get the certificate was like a badge of honor. You had to write a PhD. You had to have 450 hours of analysis and 50 hours of group. And you had to have courses in maturation, history, theory, 2 clinical practicums. And I had all the time in the world. So I worked as a software trainer, that was my trade, while I studied psychoanalysis into my mid-40s, just because there was no license. And finally, I decided to get a counselor's license. Here I was, 17 years of training and sort of a PhD, and I got a mental health license. And, that was really hard, because I made much more in my trade teaching software than I made as a therapist. And then, psychoanalysis became accredited. I got a PhD, I got a license, and all of a sudden I was in the game. But in the meantime, if I had been studying when psychoanalysis is accredited, I would have done it in 5 years, not 17. So I was sitting in the main thing about psychoanalysis is that you learn to use your emotions as an instrument. So if somebody comes in the room, you're gauging how disconnected you feel, how chaotic you feel, how disturbed you feel, how at peace you feel or comfortable, and it tells you an enormous amount about the patient. But you have to have so much of your own therapy, and you have to know your own psyche so well to distinguish between your own impressions and what's coming at you from the patient. And of course, you can never be sure, but you do find out. But you just have to be okay with the whole process. And I was in classes so many years where people were processing narratives that I got phenomenal training. And now that I'm into my 60s and I've been doing it for a while, it's really showing up, because I can work with a very wide range of pathologies. Mm-hmm. It's a nice story in the end. It wasn't a very easy story to live.
You mentioned using emotion as an instrument in your book, The Making of a Psychoanalyst. Do you want to tell our listeners a little bit about that book? Carli and I both started reading it actually a few days ago, so we haven't quite got through it yet, but so far it's wonderful, and I'm wondering if you can tell the listeners about it.
Theory without cases is hard to connect to. So when you learn theories of the mind, and we have so many that have come out of Freud. We have drive theory, which looks at your libido and your aggression energies in your system and how you manage them, what you do when you're angry. Do you attack yourself? Do you attack others? Where's your libido going, meaning your energy for life? So that's drive theory. We have object relations theory, which is how you grew up, your relationships to people and your therapist. We have structural theory, id, ego, superego. We have theories of defenses. What are you defending against? There's conflict theory. What's your intrapsychic conflict? And all of this is meaningless unless you have a case in front of you. Who cares about these theories of the mind? But what they do make it possible for you to get fascinated with people, because you may get a drive theory patient who's all drives, like I had an NFL football player once, man, it was just all, instinctual energy. And then you'll get object relations patients who are having relationship problems. You get patients, and the more theory you have, the more you can get fascinated by things that ordinarily would turn most people off, like someone who's battering their child, or someone who wants to have sex with children, or someone who's, really racist. I mean, horrible, horrible people that nobody wants to be near. We have to treat these people. So without meta theory, it's difficult. But between meta theory and our own emotions as instruments, it becomes really interesting and quite marvelous and wonderful. So my book tells those stories, brings the people to you, and what they're feeling and what they're doing. Experience my repugnance or insecurity, and I take you through that as we sort through how you bring theory and clinical method to help people be more connected to themselves. When we're more connected to ourselves is when we can become much better people. So my book is I think 7 stories. I don't even remember, or 6 or 7 or 8, whatever. And then there are essays that then bring you into the theory after, so that you're always thinking in terms of a feeling or a dynamic. Mm-hmm. And I wrote it, and it's a beginner book.
Mm-hmm. That brings me to just the idea of training in general. And Laura and I are both 4th-year doctoral students in a clinical psychology program. Personally, I'm very interested in psychoanalytic training, so it's something I'm thinking about for the future. However, can you speak a little bit to just training in general, the importance of connection, knowing oneself, and then I would like to talk maybe a little bit more about the institutionalization of training programs, if we have time for that. But can you share a little bit more about the importance of training? Especially Laura and I are 4th-year students, so I'm curious about your experiences as a teacher, also as maybe a student yourself, about the importance of learning and training.
It is vitally important to have under your belt as much understanding about the human condition as you can, because when you're in the room with a disturbed person, you always have to be clinical, and you cannot be with that person feeling what they're feeling and entering into their conflict and their chaos and their rage or their extreme sadness without having an ability to think about it, to be at least one step ahead of them in asking questions and getting them to unfold. So the training that I underwent had 4 parts to it. It had learning psychoanalytic history, which I think is, sort of okay, intellectually. It had theory. I'm really big into theory because that I can apply. And then it had the clinical work, methodology, learning how we, techniques for how we intervene with patients, how we ask questions, how we make communications or interpretations, the timing, all that. And finally, your own therapy, which in my day was the most important, because it was felt that if you don't have your own therapy, you'll either be defended against it or you'll be projecting onto the patient. And so without the training analysis and the supervision, which is in the training analysis, you couldn't really be with the patient. And we had to go into a mental hospital in my day, which is, I think, chapter 5 in my book, to work with psychosis. And all we had were 3 object-oriented questions. We had to sit there with psychosis without a clipboard, without, trying to get them to stop smoking or trying to get them to do art like all the other students were doing. And we just read questions, and it was brutal. Locked chronic wards, and it was frightening and brutal, but probably the richest aspect of my training, learning to sit in the room. And I failed my internship. if you've read that chapter, and I had to go back after 2 years and be in that ward. But does your training have a clinical component and analytic component?
Yeah, so our training requires a practicum experience. Our school is unique in that you can take several practicum experiences at once. So Laura and I have, we've experienced a lot of different types of sites. So a medical setting, university mental health, or university counseling, community mental health, inpatient, private practice. So just kind of a wealth of experiences that we've been fortunate enough to get.
Perfect.
Mm-hmm. We don't have our own psychoanalytic, therapy to go through. Although I do think it would be important for students to experience some form of therapy themselves. I feel pretty strongly about that, but it seems like a lot of training institutes don't really encourage that very much.
Well, the lay analytic institutes require 350 hours. And then if you become a training analyst, you have to be in a supervision. That's the only way to control for the projection and subjective countertransference piece of it. I learned a lot. Mm-hmm. So if you have clinical internships, that I think is very fruitful. It's what you can't bear. Also, throughout the whole process, I got married. I got my MRS. And I learned a lot about myself trying to be with another person, who I'm still with miraculously. And then we had 2 children. And so I had to learn all about child development and relive what it felt like I had a traumatic childhood. So your training, hopefully, extends beyond the walls of the classroom and beyond the walls of the analytic, and starts to become a way of thinking and being and understanding the world according to theory, so that you can start to almost see your own growth and eventually see your own defenses, and eventually see your own psychotic core, and eventually understand the whole ancestral pattern of disturbance and trauma that you may have been born into, which is very, very rich and almost like the equivalent of a Buddhist enlightenment, if you will.
You mentioned
I'm glad you think it's important, Laura, because it's...
Oh, go ahead. I'm sorry.
Well, I think that it's the best part for you personally. That's what helped me with my MRS and my family life and to heal. I mean, you get a lot of bang for your buck when you decide to undertake that.
Yes.
You work on your resistances to success, That's the kind of the good part.
Yes. Dr. Luiz, you mentioned a pretty significant, I guess you called it a failure in your internship or your practicum placement. And it sounded like you went back a few years later. Can you share a little bit about what that experience meant to you and what it felt like, and really ultimately how it's really helped you develop as a psychoanalyst, having to go back and having to redo it again?
Oh my gosh, that's a great question that really gets to the heart of who I am as a practitioner and what I've gone through to become a practitioner. When I went into the locked chronic wards of Metropolitan State Hospital, I felt all of my own disturbance. And I was really, really afraid of mental illness. And as long as I was treating somebody, I didn't have those feelings. I was almost getting on top of those feelings. But having no structure and just being asked to be there with the patient and see what it was like, I literally had a fender bender on the way to the hospital once. Would get so scattered. I just hated going. I hated how it felt. I cheated. I wrote up more hours, and and I applied to business school. I decided when I failed that this was not for me. I wanted to become an entrepreneur. And I only applied to one school, Harvard, which you can't get into. I didn't get in. So I went back, like with my head sinking low, back to the school, and I saw my supervisor going up the stairs. I came in and I called up to her. I said, I didn't get in. And she said, oh, good, and kept going. She didn't want me to stop. So I fucking went back to that hellhole. And I had to face that feeling, and I had to face how disorganized I felt, and I have not stopped facing that to some degree or other since I had to open myself up to that. Mm-hmm. Because each new level of development that I rise into, each new level of success brings me back face to face again with those primal fears. It's like every time you shift consciousness, you open yourself up to your consciousness in a different way. So I feel a lot more at ease with it now at 60 than I did then in my early 20s. They don't even allow kids in their 20s to do more. You have to have a master's. Mm-hmm. And I didn't back in the day, but they've now realized that they won't take kids like 21, 22 and put them in that environment. I was too young.
It seems to me like psychoanalysis requires a lot of courage and vulnerability and openness. And I'm wondering how you're able to tap into that for yourself.
The other side of that courage and that vulnerability is really feeling alive and connected to your patients who are doing better in life and really, really count on you. And it's such a soul-to-soul connection. So I learned how psychotic patient at hospital, and I learned what would make her stay with me in the room. She used to call me her best girlfriend, which made me nauseous. It literally, I had a body response to this woman calling me her best girlfriend. And by the end of that, I understood the oneness that she needed. And as I write in the book, she took me one day. She said, "Come with me." It was the last time I saw her, and we went down into the bowels of the hospital where only the patients were, and there was all psychotic patients there, just rocking and smoking. And I sat there with her that day, and it was she was comfortable with me. She was finally comfortable with me, and she got moved to a halfway house. She was well enough to leave the chronic ward just from having had the experience of sitting with somebody who could learn to tolerate her. It turned out to be a very healing experience for her, and I learned the power and beauty of staying the course. So there is a reward on the other side of it. And now that it takes a lot less courage for me now in my 60s, knowing that reward. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Yeah, it really has me thinking about some of Winnicott's work, and being able to accept those hateful feelings in ourselves allows us to better connect to our patients. It sounds like you had maybe a similar experience of really accepting those feelings of disgust, those bodily reactions that you had to her, and being able to see the flip side of that is, hey, I'm able to connect with her.
Yes, it changes your world. It opens up your world. And it makes it possible to know that when patients start to disintegrate and open up, there is a process of disintegration, that there is a light at the end of the tunnel. Mm-hmm. So it's very important. The Winnicott is a wonderful example of how, because he had the most destructive children, and he was able to understand something about them and what they really needed, and that he would stay with them no matter what. And you nailed it, because that is exactly the feeling. No matter what, you are going to stay with that feeling and stay with yourself. That's it.
Mm-hmm. It gets me thinking about some patients that we are quite repulsed by. And you had talked about that earlier in the interview, kind of these patients that you just really have a hard time with. And can you elaborate a little bit more about working with those patients and really your approach to working with not only those patients, but just really dealing with really difficult things going on around you? I mean, we're in a pandemic, and I'm just curious about how you think about that, these difficulties.
Well, you get people who behave very badly sometimes, who are they're righteous, they're unaware of their effect on people. And in that lack of awareness, they really hurt people. And they hurt you as a therapist. They're demeaning, they're belittling, they're critical, they're attacking. There's a lot of soul murder that goes on with narcissism. And you have to know that this person's mind, which is so set in a gear of destruction, is not having fun. And that the fact that this person's mind works this way, there must be some very serious defenses that keep the person from knowing how to connect with another person in a way that isn't debilitating all around. So it requires a tremendous amount of understanding that this horrible, horrible person is horrible to themselves, and that you have to know that whenever you wilt at the hands of this person's destructiveness, that's information. And you use any dread, a wilting feeling like you just want to shrink, or you feel really angry and indignant. The patient has just insulted who you are and degraded you or put you down. Sometimes a patient will keep you waiting while they take an appointment to get their nails done, little things and big things. They'll talk you down from your fee to some like ridiculously low fee, or they'll tell you things that you just can't bear to know about how they've treated another person. And you always have to stay curious, and you have to resist the temptation to get the person to see themselves from another angle. Mm-hmm. So that they can see what they're doing, and you have to instead go underneath to find out what the heck they're thinking that would lead them to not see what they're doing. Mm-hmm. So you're always having to put reality aside and stay in a friendly relationship with the most horrible, unfriendly, miserable, disgusting, and pitiful people, to keep going underneath. So you can work with masochism, which is really pathetic. You can work with pedophilia, you can work with batterers, you can work with ex-cons, you can work with pretty much, the most awful people. Mm-hmm. And occasionally you can decide that you don't want to. It's not good to have more than a few really awful people in your practice.
Yeah, I was going to say, I think a lot of clinicians would probably turn a lot of those people elsewhere and would not take on some of those patients. I'm wondering how you take on those patients and what makes it kind of doable for you.
Well, my patients who don't behave that badly still have blind spots. So I've learned with every patient, and I've learned with myself and my own awfulness, if you will. When you have children, your children will be the first people when they're teenagers to tell you how badly you see the world. And so they're tremendously useful to help you see your own awfulness and your own character if you respect them. And you are always, with everybody, interested in the awfulness. So I'm a family therapist, so I see couples and parents and children. And when you work with the whole family, you see how horribly people treat each other because they can't see each other. So I've been trained everywhere to get past the awfulness and understand what the narrative is. Once you get the patient to tell you their deepest story and to tell you their narrative and connect to what they haven't yet spoken, the rest just disappears. You don't work on the symptom. We're not CBT, we're not DBT. We're analysts. We want to understand the unconscious. As soon as someone speaks the unconscious, the whole world changes. You don't have to do much.
So we're coming to the end of our agreed upon time, and I respect your time. I do really want to touch on feminist theory a little bit, and I'm wondering about how you view feminist theory and how you see it dovetailing with psychoanalysis or psychoanalytic theory.
Well, for me, as a feminist who believes in woman power, meaning connection, I'm one, if people take such exception to women saying, I'm sorry all the time, I'm sorry. But it really reflects that women have a sense of the other person. We always have that, the women's sensibility, the way we multitask, that we are designed and hardwired to have other people in our consciousness. And I think that's very important for power, not to be in a world where you're more like a man, but to be in a world that's more connected. And it's much more complicated. I don't even know where and when it's doable, but the depth, to me, the power of femininity and the power of femaleness is to when I see a family and I see the way that men and women work together effectively, or a woman and a woman work together effectively, or a man and a man work together, there's always somebody who's got the ability to move a project forward and someone who's got the ability to have depth around it. And together, when you put the two sensibilities, then really progresses ahead, getting kids into good schools, buying a house if they want, saving money, whatever the goal is. So I like male energy because it's very goal-oriented, and I like female energy because it's very complex and introspective. This is just how I conceptualize. But as far as looking at feminist theory, I really love the idea of women bringing to the table a much more related way of dealing with the world. So, young people today are so much less divided in gender. I'm so excited by it. In my day, everything was much more divided. It's such a better world now, in my opinion, as far as gender relations. Everything, race relations, gender relations, the patriarchy. I'm feeling optimistic. There's a lot I know to be done, and I think it's hard work. I know how difficult the Black Lives Matter movement is for my Black patients. It's so painful to have to come to terms with all of this instead of just move forward, goal-oriented, open yourself up again. But it's worth it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, in many ways, it seems like the Black Lives Matter movement calls for this feminine energy that you were talking about, this relational energy. Instead of kind of like what you said, instead of just focusing on goals and goal orientation, we really need to kind of step back and tap into that feminine energy a little bit. Yeah,
because the Black Lives Matter movement is about us learning the pain and the stories, and to be learning that means that the person who's telling the story has to be willing to open themselves up to it, you know, and not be in that goal of, I'm just going to really be good at what I do, which is what most of the culture has had to do for all these generations. Just really be goal-oriented and excellent, and to be opening up now, it's not easy.
I have absolutely loved our conversation today, and though I wish that we have more time to talk, I would like to end with one more question for you. The podcast was really developed for growth, for development, for learning more about all sorts of different topics. And I'm wondering if you can share maybe one thing that you've learned over the past year, whether it's in your personal life or professional life, and really what impact that has made on you and how you imagine kind of going forward in the future.
Well, the main thing with psychoanalysis, and this relates to my personal life, is that it's the terrible moments that count. So my husband got cancer last year, and it was a terrible year in every way. And I got in touch with some fears, because it really brings you to the life or death situation. And I had my own breakdown over it, despair and depression. And I learned so much about myself and about certain patients that I had not been able to work with, certain dynamics that were just too big for me. Every time something is too big, there is so much richness there. And I learn it, and I relearn it, and I relearn it, and then you come out of the other side and learn more about how your mind works and more about how to be in the world. It just really gives you hope. It gives you hope about your worst moments, the moments when you're a big baby. I just did an Instagram on this. Moments when you feel pathetic or worthless or humiliated or enraged and incensed and outraged and disappointed and heartbroken and in grief. These are the moments where everything is happening for psychoanalysis so stay with them, get fascinated. No, it doesn't matter how advanced you are in the field, you're growing. You want to just keep growing, and all the insecurities and all of the dread and difficult moments are where the growth is. So don't be afraid of it, and that's the best advice that I want to give to any student or any human being.
That's great advice.
Good.
Thank you so much for being with us today. It truly means a lot to us that you took the time to speak with us. I mean, I speak for myself, but I'm sure Carli feels the same way. I was a little bit nervous coming into the interview just because we just feel like you're such a phenomenal clinician. So the fact that you took time out to talk to us really means a lot, and we thank you for it.
Well, thank you. It helps me get clarity on my ideas, and I enjoyed so much, and to have such warm, receptive listeners was just wonderful for me. So thank you. Wonderful questions.
Dr. Luiz, can you share with our listeners where they can find you if they want to find out more about you?
They can find me at claudialuiz.com. I'm on Instagram now, where I'm putting out information and videos. I'm on Facebook. And those are 3 good places.
So we just finished recording with Dr. Claudia Luiz, and Carli and I decided to do a short reflection on the interview because we just felt like it was so profound and we got so much out of it. And unfortunately, as you could probably hear, our technology was acting up a little bit today. So unfortunately, we lost a little bit of what Dr. Luiz was trying to share with us just because of lag and issues with Zoom and all that. So that is really unfortunate, but we do want to spend a little time talking about our thoughts on the interview and do a short reflection for you all.
One thing that I really got from Dr. Luiz was her courageousness. Mm-hmm. And I see her as being someone very courageous. And to be honest, I don't see a lot of women really being bold with what they believe, what they feel. And her ability to do it unflinchingly is amazing. It was really awesome to see that.
Yes, I totally agree. That's the one word that kept coming to mind was courage, courage, courage. The whole time she was talking, when she was talking about, you know, sitting with the disturbing and the awful and the disgusting and the terrible, and being willing to open that up within herself and being willing to kind of face her own demons in the process of doing psychoanalysis with patients. Like, that's the word that kept coming to mind, is courage, and how much courage it must take for her to be that person every single day. And I agree with you, Carli. I think she's a very bold woman, and I'm very struck by that, and I'm very inspired by it. It's something that I aspire to, I think.
I do too, and it's something I've been reflecting a lot about over the last few years, is really how to embody my boldness, because I see myself as being quite bold, and I'm just really scared to allow that part of me out into the open, especially in the classroom, especially in supervision. I just wish that I was able to feel a little bit more comfortable saying what's on my mind, regardless of really how it's going to be perceived by others.
Yes. Yeah. And I think that takes a lot of practice and a lot of time. I'm imagining that it gets easier as we continue on this journey. But she's definitely somebody that I look up to. And I didn't know much about her until you invited her on the podcast, Carli. So I'm so glad that you did. I feel like she's a wonderful, incredible, not only psychoanalyst, but human being. Mm-hmm. And I really liked what she said. You know, I wish we would have gotten more time to talk to her about feminist theory and its influence on her work. But I was really loving what she was saying about, you know, these general energies that she's picked up on, the male energy and the female energy, and how the female energy is very relational. What were your thoughts on that?
You know, it's interesting because when we think of gender, when we think of femininity, at least I don't necessarily think of these energies and really what someone brings to a relationship. And I'm really glad she brought that up, because though people sometimes talk about that, I don't think it's a large component of how we view gender. And I'm really happy that she was able to talk about that and share kind of how she views femininity and how it impacts a relationship, how it impacts a movement like the Black Lives Matter movement.
Yeah, it's so powerful. And I think too, sometimes as a society, at least in recent years, we've gotten a little uncomfortable with talking about male energy versus female energy, femininity versus masculinity. It seems like, on the one hand, it seems like a very binary kind of frame of mind to put ourselves in, but I think it also, on the other hand, it also offers just like a different way of thinking about things in a way that we don't really think about things a whole lot.
I mean, it's surely not something we talk about in our classes. We don't often talk about what the gender brings to the relationship. We might think of that in terms of some like family therapy, that type of thing, but we don't often talk about how gender is brought into the relationship in terms of these energies. And I love that she covered it. I honestly had no idea that she was even going to talk about that today, and I'm so glad she did. It got me thinking about it a little bit more.
Yeah, same. Me too. I was also glad that she talked about her own training and how she got into psychoanalysis. I just find her story so fascinating. And I do wish we would have gotten more of a chance to talk a little bit about institutes and training institutes and, you know, kind of how she views those, because I think she'd probably have some very interesting thoughts on training institutes. But again, we just didn't have the time or the technology today to allow for that, unfortunately.
Well, I think that we will be discussing this in the future, and she really kind of piqued our interest in these topics. I think we're both pretty interested in them, but I think it got us thinking even more about these topics. And I really look forward to talking about these ideas in future episodes.
Yes, she definitely gave us a lot to chew on. I look forward to it as well. This episode of the Unconventional Dyad podcast is sponsored by Anchor. Anchor is the easiest way to make a podcast. The most important thing about Anchor is that it's free. They also have creation tools that allow you to record and edit your podcast right from your phone or computer. Anchor will distribute your podcast for you, so it can be heard on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and many more. It's everything you need to make a podcast all in one place. Download the free Anchor app or go to anchor.fm to get started.
Hello, Unconventional Dyad podcast listeners. We are so excited that you are joining the conversation with us. If you're liking what you're hearing and you would like to support the podcast, there are a few different ways to do that. We have a Patreon page now, so if you visit patreon.com/unconventionaldyad, you can support us through 4 different support tiers. You can also support us through the Anchor app. There's a support function, and you can choose from 3 different tiers, from as little as 99 cents per month. We really hope that you are liking the content so far. You can also check out our website where we post weekly blogs that you can comment on, and we hope that you join in the conversation with us. Let us know what you think.